Chapter 10. What 60 Mikes do. Kneeling behind the monstrous, vine-wrapped fallen tree that marked the limit of Alpha 19's advance, Corporal Power's grenade duel with the invisible NVA continued until he finally told Corporal Garrett, behind the tree with him, that he was going to pull back to hunt up some more grenades. With fire snapping overhead, Power shoved off on his belly and headed for the bogged-down Marines spread out in the 3 side-by-side paddy fields west of these NVA entrenchments. Only several hundred meters west of Bravo Company, Alpha Company had been stopped cold while still crossing these 3 overgrown, shell-pocked paddies. They had been carved into a slight ridge line that ran east-west, so that their southern flank rose up into trees and bushes and bamboo, and their northern flank fell away into brush-dotted flatlands carpeted with elephant grass. It was far to the north across this shallow valley that another low tree-lined ridge rose into view, atop which NVA machine gunners fired on the jets supporting Bravo Company to the east. As Corporal Power pushed himself along, he bumped into a Marine whom he did not know who'd been hit in the upper arm. The man was already crawling back toward the easternmost paddy's hedgerow, so Power grabbed onto his gear and, remaining flat at all times, got him through the shrubbery and into the paddy. There, they ran into Sankey and Duckworth, the assistant forward observer and his radioman, who also lent a hand in pulling the wounded man back. They felt safe enough now to get up a little bit as they moved toward the casualty collection point the corpsman had established at the southeastern corner of the paddies. The first NVA 60mm mortar round arched from its tube then. The 3 paddies that Alpha Company was strung across had been pre-registered so that of the hundreds of rounds the NVA mortar men would pump out, not a single one would fall wide of the mark. Boom! Boom! The second round had fallen closer to them than the first. It was obvious where the third would be, so Power and Sankey dropped the wounded man and went flat to his left and right. Duckworth started to hurdle a log to their front. Power was looking up at him from under his helmet brim and boom. He saw an explosion of smoke and dirt a millisecond before Duckworth completed his dive. Ah fuck, that had to get him. It did. But Ducky was a tough little dude, and he crawled back to them under his own power, shouting not in pain, but in anger, "Fuck, I'm hit. Got me in the ass. Fuck, of all goddamn places." Boom. 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 Captain Slater had made it to the northern hedgerow of the easternmost paddy, and from there he could hear the NVA mortar tubes thunking from somewhere along that ridge across the valley to their north. To neutralize them with counter-battery fire, Slater needed a firm fix on their position, so he stood at the edge of the perimeter, hands on hips, looking and listening. Power could see Slater from where he was flattened with Sankey and Duckworth and their wounded charge, and he was amazed once again at their skipper's cool. Good old Captain Contact. The only other man not on his belly was one of Slater's radio men, LCPL Robert W. Genty, a slim, blond, tight-muscled dude who stood beside the skipper now with apparent nonchalance as they studied the ridge line to the north. Boom. 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 Alpha Company had a 3-tube 60mm mortar section, whose crews had begun setting up as soon as it had become clear that they had a fight on their hands. They got their tubes up in 3 separate shell craters in the middle paddy, but they were not firing and Captain Slater told Gunny Santamasso to find out why. Santamasso simply stood up, then strode down the dike and into the clear, and disappeared through the hedgerow separating the easternmost paddy from the middle paddy as he bellowed with gravel in his throat, "Where are them goddamn mortars?" Boom. Boom, boom. Power and Sankey dragged the man with the arm wound to where the corpsmen were at the southeast corner, then, during a brief lull Power took off toward Captain Slater. More mortar rounds crashed in, and he ended up in an old bomb crater with Corporal Garrett, both of them nervous because their crater was a large one, the size of a small room, which increased the chance of lightning striking twice. The crater was 5 or 6 feet deep, and Power looked over its edge, searching for a smaller, safer shelter he could dash to during the next lull. It was then that a round exploded in the casualty collection point. Garrett, a good old hot rod driving Alabama boy, completely flipped out with an anguished cry, "Jesus fucking Christ, it hit right in the middle of them guys. I gotta go help, em. Don't go. Garrett was a new guy. He started out of the crater and Power made a grab for his legs. He missed. Garrett was up and over the lip of the crater. He made it 3 or 4 strides, boom. And then he was down, his ass and leg torn up. Power jumped out of the crater to drag him back in. He lay at the bottom, wiggling and kicking, hurting bad but hanging tough. Power began to realize just how deeply they were all in trouble. We are in a bad fight and it ain't being looked after. It ain't being run right. Captain Slater was concentrating on pushing through to Bravo Company, and Power could only think that the skipper was so aggressive, so intent on completing his mission that, like at Fuan, he was throwing haymakers with both hands instead of keeping one up to guard. Alpha Company was scattered across the 3 paddies with little tactical coherency, except at the point where Slater was pushing. Everything is geared toward Bravo, but we're in bad sit here and we ain't taking care of business. Captain Slater knew that Alpha Company was in trouble, but he also knew that Bravo was in much more desperate straits. He had managed to make radio contact with somebody on the Bravo TAC. It seemed to be a young radio man, and Slater had never heard anything so pathetic and heart-rending. My God, they're everywhere. Everybody that I can see is dead. Get to me fast or we're all gone. Every time we raise our heads, we get blown away. They're shooting right down our throats. Please get here. Right now. We're going to be there in just a couple of minutes. Hang on, keep your head down. There was a long lull in the mortaring. Alpha Company had accumulated too many casualties to fight and move simultaneously, but Bravo could not survive the wait for Alpha's medevacs. Hating to do it, Slater decided to split his command. He would immediately send Staff Sergeant Leslie's 1st Platoon north, to get around the NVA line to their east, with instructions to swing east to join Bravo. Taking the time to muster fire support, he would then personally accompany Staff Sergeant Richardson's 2D platoon in the trace of 1st Platoon. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Muller's 3D platoon was to establish a medevac LZ in the westernmost of the 3 paddies they now occupied. After the medevacs, which Slater was presently requesting, Muller was to fold up his all-around defense and follow them to Bravo. Thus decided, Captain Slater collared Staff Sergeant Leslie, "You guys get to Bravo. You get down to Bravo. Go." Staff Sergeant Leslie, their best platoon commander, was a kind-hearted, lion-hearted moose of a man. He cracked a big, unflappable grin. "All right, sir. You mean high diddle-diddle, right up the middle? Goddamn right, that's what I mean. Don't delay with the wounded. Take your wounded with you and leave your dead. You get there." Captain Slater also turned to LCPL Ronald W. Fazio, one of the company's perennial point men, and told him to catch up with Gunny Santamasso, who was off hunting up their mortars. Slater wanted their 60 MMs, plus as many M79 men as he could round up to join him in 2D platoon. Fazio found Santamasso all right, but as the Gunny had already discovered, their mortar section had only 1 tube left. 1 crew had been put out of commission with wounds from a near miss, and another crew had been snuffed out by the direct hit of an NVA mortar round in their crater. Fazio looked in to see that one of his best friends was among the mangled dead. Fazio had just rejoined the company from the hospital. He wasn't ready for this. Everything's mixed up, hopeless. He hustled back toward the skipper with the bad news, almost muttering what he was thinking, "We're not making it out of here." When Captain Slater and Gunny Santamasso rejoined each other, Slater explained that he was going to try and push through to Bravo Company. He was going to keep his primary radioman, Lance Corporal Genty, who had done a hell of a job at his side in Fuan, while he wanted Santamasso to take the other company radioman, LCPL Thomas T. Cresson, and assist the inexperienced Lieutenant Muller. "You stay here with the 3rd Platoon. Get a medevac in." Meanwhile, during the long lull as casualties were carried to the westernmost paddy, Slater, who was still standing along the northern hedgerow line dike, told Sergeant Guizer and his radioman, PFC Ross, to place artillery on the ridge to their north. This geyser did, blanketing both the forested ridge line with explosions and, because he suspected that NVA reinforcements were humping through the tall elephant grass, the shallow valley between them. As geyser adjusted the fire, he actually edged off the dike and into the paddy, disregarding potential sniper fire so as to see his targets without any brushy obstacles. After the fire mission, he continued scanning the terrain to the north, and he happened upon a movement 200 meters out. That didn't pose a problem because he was easily an expert shot within 300 meters, but when he shouldered his M16 he realized he was staring down the barrel at a man with a flak jacket carrying another flak-jacketed man over his shoulder. Whoa, that's got to be a Marine. Geyser lowered his M16, then thought, damn it, it can't be. It can't be Bravo, 'cause he's too far away from Bravo and it's not Alpha. He raised his M16 again and literally put the sights on the back of the head of the man who was carrying his comrade. Damn it, I don't want to live with myself if I kill a Marine. Again, he let the barrel dip in his hands, but this time, just as the man was about to enter a thicket of bamboo, Geyser realized that he wore no helmet and had almost shoulder-length black hair. Damn it, why didn't I notice that first? Geyser sighted in a third time with definite intent to kill, but the figure disappeared into the bamboo before he could squeeze the trigger. Chapter 11. Alpha a Go-Go. Lieutenant Muller of the 3D Platoon, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, had a wife and child and, in civilian life, had been a lawyer, but upon assignment to Vietnam his patriotism had demanded of him that he request a line unit. Slater had been glad to get him, and mostly he thought well of his performance. Likewise, CPL James J. Chink Toy, a Chinese-American and a squad leader in the 3D platoon, had been impressed when Muller first came aboard and said that he, Muller, realized he was inexperienced and that he wanted advice from his squad leaders and old-timers. That was the first and only time that Toy had seen a new lieutenant who didn't come on like a gung-ho prick, and in stocky, chubby, personable Muller, he sensed they had an officer who genuinely cared. Just a wonderful man, Toy thought. Most of the old-timers, however, were absolutely impatient with Muller as he learned on the job, to the point that some even approached Slater, "Hey, sir, the lieutenant's no good, he's going to get us killed," and rejected and depressed. Muller had come to Slater shortly before Operation Buffalo and commented that Regimental Legal had offered him a job. "They'd like me back in the rear to run some courts-martial. It's up to you." Slater still had faith in Muller. "You know, you're coming along. You're doing well. Hang in there a little bit longer. I think we're just about ready to bring that platoon of yours around." Lieutenant Muller stayed, but he simply had not had enough bush time by the beginning of Operation Buffalo to have absorbed all the lessons. His medevac LZ perimeter around the westernmost of the three paddies was proof of that. Really ragged, thought even Corporal Toy. The line was thin because men were needed to rush the casualties to the center of that overgrown paddy. Medevacs were on the way in of the men who remained along the hedgerows. Some were in positions that allowed them good fields of fire and some were not. No one had been assigned specific areas to cover, everyone had just been told to face outboard and watch out, and in the confusion, some Marines were even facing the wrong way. The goddamn 3rd Platoon perimeter is not for shit. So thought Corporal Power as he and PFC Sankey helped the wounded Garrett into it. They came back again with Duckworth and another walking wounded leaning on them for support, then Power and Sankey headed back to the middle paddy. They were just on the eastern side of the hedgerow dividing the two paddies when two helicopters were seen approaching from the southeast. Smoke was popped in the LZ. The first Seahorse settled down on its rubber wheels. The priority evacs were loaded aboard, then it was up and out. Power had been wounded at Fuan when the NVA mortared their medevacs. That old feeling hit him as the second Seahorse began its descent, and he told Sankey to get down. They dropped into separate shell craters. The Seahorse landed on the western side of their hedgerow. Boom! 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 The NVA mortars abruptly began a renewed barrage, at the same time that several NVA machine guns opened fire on the LZ from the west and north. Power could see the old 34 Seahorse shaking as it came out of the LZ, taking hits but still making it up and away. The two medevacs had gotten all of Alpha Company's wounded except for 7 with minor injuries and a smaller handful of shell-shocked Marines. Boom! 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 Sergeant Guiser and his radio man, PFC Ross, were positioned about 7 feet up the low ridge line that ran east-west and defined the southern edge of the 3 paddies that were terraced into its slope. Specifically, Guiser and Ross were above the westernmost paddy LZ in a shell crater that had been scooped out of a small open area in the bamboo atop the ridge, a perfect spot from which to adjust artillery fire. Their wounded partner Duckworth was also with them, and they had just been joking enviously about his $1 million wound. But Ducky reacted instantly to the renewed firing, jumping from the crater and running to where he thought he might find Sankey, who now carried the radio, so as to keep the 2FO teams separate. Far to the north, Guiser could see puffs of smoke in what he knew was North Vietnam, and the muffled kettle drumming of outgoing artillery soon became the whistling rush of incoming. Crash! Crash! Boom! Boom! Crash! Crash! After 16 months of hearing U.S. artillery going over his head, Guiser was finally hearing NVA artillery coming down on his head. It was a terrible experience and an ominous sign for, although the NVA regularly shelled fixed positions like Con Tien, they rarely expended their artillery shells on the Marines' bush positions. That they did so now meant that the NVA foot soldiers around them had their own forward observer teams with radio communications back to the firing batteries in North Vietnam. Meanwhile, wildly relieved that their medevacs had gotten out despite the ring of fire, Captain Slater started off with 2D platoon, following 1st platoon's path. He had a final radio conversation with Lieutenant Muller of 3D platoon, make sure that perimeter's secure now. I'm going to leave with the rest of the company, and we're going down the hill and join Bravo. The NVA light infantrymen used the cover of their artillery and mortars to move into position for a ground assault on the solitary platoon in their hedgerow-encased LZ. The NVA moved in teams of 4, carrying AK-47s or RPGs, plus as many as 12 grenades apiece and a very occasional flamethrower. They were expertly camouflaged with elephant grass slipped through bands around their pith helmets and bush hats, on their backpacks and ammo vests, and around their arms and legs. The NVA were absolutely invisible when they knelt in the 3 to 4 foot high elephant grass, and they stole right up to the edge of the LZ perimeter. The NVA were basically coming in under their own artillery and mortars hardcore, and since the Marines were heads down under this fire, they were undetected. When the NVA were close enough, they sprang up in the elephant grass and came running and firing toward the hedgerows. Only then did the NVA artillery and mortars cease firing. The sun was blazing above these open paddies. This is happening too fast, thought PFC Charles Ragland, a black member of a machine gun team who, along with LCPL Jack Rush and PFC Paul Forbes, raked the elephant grass in front of their hedgerow position. There had been nothing one moment, then a swarming rush of NVA had materialized from nowhere. Lot of people think a chain gun can take care of itself, but all a gunner has on his mind is knocking out what's in front of him. Ragland wished a fire team had been sent in with them as security. We can't be looking all over the place. Ragland was terrified of their unprotected position and nervous about some of the Marines deployed along the hedgerow on either side of him. Lot of boots in Alpha. They don't know what's coming off, they don't know what to expect, they don't know how to work together. An NVA was screaming in English to cease fire, and although Ragland, Rush, and Forbes kept their M60 blazing, some of the new guys stopped shooting. Their confusion was compounded by the fact that some of the NVA charging through the tall grass wore Marine helmets and Marine flak jackets. These guys they had never saw nothing, they just out here, and some of them are actually freezing. Most weren't. It appeared to LCPL David J. Dishong, a rocket man, that the NVA were unaware of the hedgerow position occupied by him and Corporal Alonso's squad. Alonso threw several grenades into their ranks. Several NVA appeared to go sprawling in the elephant grass. Then he directed artillery fire in as close as possible to the hedgerow edge of their perimeter. More NVA went down. They finally caught sight of Alonso's squad, and thinking they'd be pretty swift about it, as Dishang sarcastically phrased it, the NVA started a brushfire. The wind drove the fire into the hedgerow, and with the NVA coming right behind the flames, Alonso passed the word to fall back. Dishang unslung his 4 law rockets, hurled them into the fire, then started off, turning to watch with great satisfaction as they exploded just as the NVA reached the hedgerow. The LZ perimeter disintegrated. The NVA were coming through the hedgerow to the right of the M60 team's sole survivor, Ragland, played dead as the NVA overran the position. One NVA picked up his M16 and threw it to the side, and another grabbed him and fired 3 shots beside his head. Ragland played his role well, though, and the NVA let him go as his team rushed on. Ragland watched through barely opened eyes as the next team of 4 NVA came through the hedgerow, walking trees, he thought, then knelt for a moment to get their bearings before moving out smartly. The first group had ignored most of the Marines lying around the hedgerow, including the immobile wounded, but when the second team moved through, Ragland saw them shoot at least one Marine in the back as he lay there. Then an NVA in the third team picked up that Marine's M16 while others tore through the pockets and packs of the dead, and the other gear that had been left behind, taking canteens, rations, and ammunition. As soon as the assault had begun on 3D platoon, Captain Slater had turned around with 2D platoon, leaving 1st platoon to make its own way east to Bravo Company. He knew that Charlie Company and elements of Delta were on the way and that 1st platoon could find sanctuary with them. The intensity of fire on 3D platoon, however, demanded immediate reinforcement. Slater tried to raise Muller on the radio as he moved back. He got no answer. Lieutenant Muller had, in fact, been killed. The story that Corporal Toy later got was that Muller's radioman cracked up and dove into a crater, or maybe the radioman had been hit and had rolled there for cover. In the confusion, who knew? Muller was running to him so as to regain radio contact when he was shot in the leg. The leg wound severed a major artery, and Muller bled to death, or maybe he was shot again, as the NVA overran his platoon. As the NVA swarmed into the westernmost paddy, Sergeant Guiser, up on the southern ridge with radioman Ross, had them in sight amid the stray rounds that snapped through the bamboo around him. He wasn't able to call in a single artillery round before one of those stray bullets caught him in the right side just below the rib cage. The sensation was as if a jackhammer had been held to that spot and punched one time. That was how Guiser visualized it. The burning pain was worse than anything he'd known was possible, and his first coherent thought was a laughing scream, "John Wayne, you son of a bitch." In the movies you get hit but can still blow away 10 Indians, but in the real life Guiser could barely breathe. "This son of a bitch has tore me up." Ross, beside Heim in the crater, immediately got on the radio to the con TNCP, 6-1 actual had been hit, 6-1. Actual has been hit. There was intense pain for an intolerably long moment, then Guiser realized he could cope with it. His mind flashed to the terrifying chance that he was paralyzed, that his spine had been hit. He was afraid to try to move, but he finally did and it was okay. He could move. Ross started to patch him, then exclaimed, "Hey, it came right out the other side, it came right out." And Guiser realized that the bullet had blown a second hole in him, an exit wound out his back only. He would later learn, a half-inch from his spinal column. Forever an NCO, though, Guiser gave Ross hell as he patched him, for the radioman had used his own field bandage, forgetting that they had been trained to use the bandage of the wounded man they were helping. Armed with only a Colt .45, the short, flinty, and highly respected gunny Santamasso stood in the drainage ditch just below the east-west hedgerow of the paddy's northern edge. A veteran of Korea, he had been Alpha Company's big-nosed, black-mustached, and shillelagh-carrying gunny for 4 months, and now, again, he was the calm in the storm as he shouted over the din, directing the survivors of 3D platoon to a large crater on the other side of the hedgerow, actually outside their original lines. Men made it toward the gunny any way they could, as Santamasso shouted at one of the Marines to retrieve an M79 from a dead Marine some 10 meters away. The man was scared and refused to go. Santamasso got on the kid's ass and decided to get the M79 himself, and immediately thought better of it, for he could suddenly hear Vietnamese voices. He couldn't see any NVA, but he could hear them coming up the hedgerow in the drainage ditch. He had already directed his radioman, Chrisan, to the refuge of the bomb crater. He was basically alone out there, and he tossed a grenade toward the voices even as he shouted at the young Marine with him to get to the crater. Then he lobbed out his second and last grenade and sprinted for the good, deep hole himself, the final one in. Gunny Santamasso shouted to one of the radio men who'd made it to this last stand position, "Get on your phone and call artillery." The kid was near tears. "I don't know how." "I don't give a shit if you know how or now. You get your FO and tell them where we're at and put it on us. This is it or we've had it." As the radio man got cracking, Gunny Santamasso squeezed .45 rounds into a crawling NVA who was about 30 meters away in the rice paddy. He dropped back down, reholstered his .45, grabbed a young Marine's M16, and raised up again to shoot a second NVA crawling through the grass. Almost immediately, other NVA pulled their comrade to cover as more NVA rushed past, trying to surround the crater. The Marines killed any NVA who exposed himself, and Santamasso turned his sights on his third NVA, who came out from behind a bush and went to one knee behind a little, stunted tree. Simultaneously, this NVA swung his AK-47 toward him. Gunny Santamasso squeezed the trigger. Nothing, no shot, and then, it was like a branding iron had been laid against his skin, a real shocking blow, as an AK-47 round caught him at belt level on his right side. He jumped down into the crater and looked to see that the round had torn through his flak jacket. He pulled out a battle dressing expecting to find a bullet hole in his guts, but it was only a nasty, painful, uncritical graze. Santamasso grabbed a young Marine with an M60 machine gun and told him to fire up the gook behind the tree with single shots. They had no ammunition to waste, and Santamasso didn't want the NVA to hear their M60. Santamasso organized a hasty, all-around defense from the 6 or 8 able-bodied Marines in the crater. He had them take ammunition off the wounded and dead they had dragged in. He shouted that there would be no rapid fire. He bandaged himself, trying to shake off the shock, then secured a second, working M16, and crouched for a moment beside the 2 corpsmen in the crater. One was in a paralytic state of shock with his eyes rolled back. At first Santamasso thought he was dead and, ignoring him, he turned to the second corpsman. This man, too, had been stunned into inaction, but he had not disappeared yet. He slowly came out of it as Gunny Santamasso slapped him and shook him by the front of his flak jacket. "We gotta have you, we gotta have you, we got too many wounded kids in here." Corporal Power unshouldered his pack, which was a more utilitarian NVA type previously taken off an NVA body, and tossed it so that he could better fit into the small crater he had sought cover in when the shelling had begun again. He was in the middle paddy about 15 feet east of the hedgerow that separated the middle paddy from the westernmost one. The NVA were coming through 3D platoon. Like shit through a goose, Power thought. He readied himself like an upside-down turtle in his miniature crater, feet against the rim, shoulders tight against the opposite rim, helmeted head trying to hunch down. He had his M16 aimed between his knees at the hedgerow. His buddy Sankey was in a similar predicament in another crater some 10 meters to his right. There were other Marines here and there in the middle paddy, but most of 2D platoon was setting up to their rear behind the dike hedgerow separating the middle paddy from the easternmost paddy. Sergeant Jefferson broke through the hedgerow. This was the Sam Hefty new guy who'd been medevaced with heat exhaustion the previous evening, only to be returned to the field this morning, and he was running now, stumbling for his life. Jefferson was already bandaged from wounds received earlier. He'd apparently missed the medevac, and now, Power watched incredulously as Jefferson took more hits. He got hit, and his run turned into a slow-motion 180-degree turn, head bent, body leaning in, until he just collapsed dead before completing his little circle in the grass. The NVA were right behind Sergeant Jefferson, coming through the hedgerow, and Power's life flashed before his eyes. He saw it all in a second, and he realized then and there that everything he had ever done, every decision he had ever made, it had all been to get him in this hole on this day. I'm dying, right here. That's it. It's over. Power shot an NVA who burst through the hedgerow with his AK-47 at port arms, jumping from the dike to the paddy. He shot the man before he even landed. He was feeling sharp. He was catching every movement. He shot another NVA who came through the bramble. He could hear Sankey to his right similarly placing short bursts into charging NVA, but in his peripheral vision he could see some NVA getting past them. The Marines along the dike behind him opened fire, dropping those NVA dead in their tracks in the high grass. The NVA stopped charging. Another stood up from behind the dike to throw a stick-handled grenade right at Power, like a line drive. He exposed himself for only a second, but Power, still on his back with his M16 between his knees, shot him. He saw the fucker jerk and drop, just before the Chi-Com hit him right in the chest where his flak jacket was unzipped. It bounced away. Other grenades thumped into the dirt an arm's length away and went off with brain-jarring blasts. There was a crossfire steel storm above Power's head with the Marines behind him getting the upper hand, and the NVA-occupied hedgerow in front of him was shuddering and disintegrating under their unrelenting fire. Power could hear an NVA shouting commands on the other side of that hedgerow. The voice moved up and down the dike, and he hated that man for such a strong, fearless voice. He hated him for keeping his men firing even as their hedgerow cover was shot to pieces. Power knew they were going to kill him. They were going to kill him as he changed magazines. He was trying to keep his bursts short. They were going to kill him with a burst to his head or chest. I hope it's in the chest. I hope it ain't in the face. Thoughts flashed through his mind even as he kept shooting. I hope the motherfucker who kills me is something of a poet, who has a little sensitivity in his soul and will realize what he's done. I hope it won't be some fucking redneck gook who's going to rub me out and think nothing of it. When CPL Sammy K. Peterson, a mortarman and salty veteran of Operation Hickory, first saw the NVA coming through the elephant grass, the helmets and flak jackets some of them wore gave him considerable pause. Might be Marines. He hesitated an additional moment before firing from his crater. If I shoot him, he's going to shoot back. Training, of course, took over, but so did hatred. The very sound of the NVA's high-pitched sing-song jabber drove Heim into a fury. It sounded like they were fucking laughing about the Marines they had killed in the LZ. Little slant-eyed bastards, Peterson thought. He opened fire and dinged a couple of them, as he put it, before the ones he could see dived into the elephant grass. He enjoyed their deaths. He wanted to crush them. He wanted to slit their throats. The NVA had the same intentions. First, the ammo man to Peterson's mortar crew got shot in the hand, then, their assistant gunner got shot in the leg. The NVA were firing toward the team's 60mm mortar, the only one left in the company, which was on its bipod beside their holes, and Peterson finally got balls enough to rush out and tip it over. The NVA fire on them slackened a bit then. The wounded A-gunner was, meanwhile, sitting in a tight hole with his wounded leg cramping up until, insane from the pain and the sun scorch, he leaped from his cover. He stumbled around, trying to ease the knots in his bleeding leg and crying for water, while everyone hollered at him to get back in his hole. Peterson thought to throw something at the man to knock him out so he could be dragged back to cover, so he slung a full canteen with all his might for a perfect hit on the man's head. It had no effect, so he finally dashed out and physically threw the wounded man back into his hole. Peterson jumped back and called to his squad leader, 2 holes down, to crawl over and massage the man's gun-shot leg to keep him from flipping out again. The squad leader shouted back, "You're crazy as hell." The NVA artillery commenced firing again. By this time, Captain Slater had reached the northern hedgerow of the three paddies. In no good position to organize or direct anything, the situation had him and his radio men at the prone ready to blow away anything that might pop up. Slater at least tried to coordinate artillery support. It was impossible. He couldn't distinguish the incoming NVA artillery from the incoming USMC artillery, and shells were impacting here, there, and everywhere. It was a madhouse. There was no way he could adjust the fire. Slater could see NVA rushing through the elephant grass to the north, and he realized there were Marines, including Gunny Santamasso, who he recognized, bobbing up from a crater out there to shoot them down. The NVA were maneuvering past this crater to assault 2D platoon's northern positions, all hastily assumed, who were also responding with well-aimed shots. The NVA were thus totally vulnerable to the Gunny's half-dozen, who would pop up one or two at a time to drop another NVA from a few feet with M16 fire. The NVA appeared totally confused by these bursts that seemed to originate from nowhere, and their attack from the north fell apart. On the low ridge overlooking the overrun LZ, Sergeant Guiser, all alone up there with PFC Ross in their bamboo-surrounded crater, was dying a million deaths. The pain of the gunshot wound that had punched through his side and out his back had become unreal. Intolerable. He bit through the chin strap of his helmet. He broke off pieces of the bamboo that he could reach. The reeds were only as wide as his little finger, and chewed them to splinters in his agony. He was still coherent enough, though, to see the new puffs of smoke from the north when the NVA artillery again commenced fire, raining steel on Marines and North Vietnamese alike in the paddies. Crash! 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 Choking back the pain, Guiser took the radio handset from Ross and made contact with the con-TNCP. He tried to call in a mission on the NVA artillery he could see in North Vietnam, but was told, "You can't call in a mission. Your assistant had a mission in progress." Either Sankey or Duckworth was bringing in the rounds, so Guiser got off the radio and concentrated on his more immediate circumstances. 7 feet down the ridge line and across a dozen meters of rice paddy there were NVA foot soldiers. The whole LZ paddy was full of them. Guiser could see them, or to be correct, he could see a paddy in which clumps of elephant grass moved. There were 2 Marines at the base of the ridge at the southwest corner of the paddies who had hopped the hedgerow dike, so they were actually outside their old perimeter. They rose at intervals to spray the LZ with M16 fire. They weren't aiming, but it was almost impossible to miss considering all the grassy clumps in the LZ. From his meager perch, Guiser could see several of the clumps heading toward the 2 isolated Marines. They approached slowly, gradually raising their heads. Their pith helmets and bush hats were completely covered with elephant grass until just their eyes were above the real grass. Then, having looked around, they crept a bit closer. Guiser turned to Ross, "Get over there and tell those sons of bitches to get up on the high ground." Ross moved out, going left down the ridge. Guiser gritted his teeth to keep from crying out in pain. Ross crawled back into the crater. He apparently could get no response from the stranded Marines, but once back under cover, he did join the downhill, shooting into the paddy. He said he got one and then his rifle jammed. Ross couldn't believe it, he was beside himself. He was defenseless. It was Guiser's turn. He'd been feeling guilty because he had an M16 and 200 rounds of ammunition, more than he needed as an artillery spotter, as well as 4 fragmentation and 2 tear gas grenades, and he had never seen such a potential turkey shoot in all his 16 months in the bush. But he was in such pain he had not fired a single shot. Again, he choked down the pain, lifted up, shouldered his rifle, and squared his sights on a clump of grass about 70 feet away that was moving toward those 2 Marines. The NVA had his face above the wave of real elephant grass. Guiser squeezed the trigger once the shot blew away most of the NVA's head, then slumped back into the crater. He was so wretched, so miserable with pain that he couldn't bring himself to fire again. All this ammo and grenades, he chided himself. His one shot had been enough, though, because now rounds kicked up around him so closely that he knew they weren't more stray shots. Somebody had him in his sights. There was another shot and Guizer knew he'd been hit. He had felt the impact under his shoulder, but when he rolled away onto his bandaged right side, he saw that the bullet had actually furrowed into the ground underneath where he'd been lying. Guizer rolled back onto his stomach, looking up with his M16 ready in his hands. He could tell from the trajectory of the impacting shots that the NVA must be in a tree. He did not, however, begin firing randomly and rapidly into the treetops. He had, after all, been raised around guns and had always been taught to conserve ammo. One of the worst things Marines do is when one enemy bullet zings in, that selector goes to automatic and, boy, they let loose. Usually to no benefit. Guizer held his fire and scanned the treetops for the sniper. But then, there was a tremendous whack to his helmet, which remained on his head, and immediately, he felt blood running down the left side of his face. The round had drilled through the left rear of his steel pot, the burst-open metal slicing through hair and skin down to the skull in a splatter of blood. The pain was not excessive, and Guizer scrambled away again. This time, he hoped, completely out of the target zone. His mind formed words meant for Ross that he shouted, or thought he shouted, or at least meant to shout. It was hard to tell. His brain was all wobbly. Hey, this guy's had his 3 tries for a quarter, and he's just getting too close. We're getting out of here.